Her small, pale fingers trembled so violently they nearly dropped the smartphone. On the glowing screen, her face was a mask of pure terror, tears blurring her vision as she whispered into the microphone, "Please, he's in the house. He's following me." On the other side of the city, the air in the room went cold. The sound of expensive ice clinking against crystal stopped instantly. The digital chime of the FaceTime call had interrupted a meeting where millions were being moved with a single nod. But the man who held the phone wasn't a rescue operator or a police officer. He was the most dangerous sovereign in Manhattan's underworld, and his reaction to those whispered words would ignite a fire that would burn the city's shadows to the ground. Stay with me until the end, because the way this predator was hunted down will leave you breathless. Before we dive into the hunt, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what would you do if a stranger's life was suddenly in your hands? Now, let's get into it. It's a rainy Friday night in modern-day Manhattan. High above the sirens and the steam of the streets, the penthouse of the Blackwood Tower sits like a fortress of glass and steel. This is the inner sanctum of Marcus Blackwood. In this room, the silence is a weapon. The staff is hand-picked to be invisible. The guards are trained to be lethal. This is a place where the law of the land stops at the front door and Marcus's word begins. Marcus sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, a man in his early 30s who looked more like a dark god than a businessman. His black suit was sharp enough to cut, but the open collar of his white shirt revealed the edges of tattoos that climbed his chest, reminders of the wars he had fought to sit on this throne. At 32, he'd achieved what took most men a lifetime: absolute, terrifying control. He operated with surgical precision, viewing the city as a chessboard where emotions were nothing but a liability. He had survived the cutthroat streets of New York because he followed one golden rule: never let the world see you bleed, and never let a stranger inside your walls. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, that rule was about to be shattered by a 7-year-old girl in a pink floral dress. Marcus Blackwood moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of a predator that knew it owned the jungle. High above the rain-lashed streets of Manhattan, the penthouse was a cathedral of glass, steel, and secrets. To the outside world, this was the headquarters of Blackwood Global, but to those who lived in the city's shadows, it was the throne room of a king who ruled through ironclad silence. Outside, the city hummed with the frantic energy of millions, but inside the office, the air was thick with a stillness that felt like a held breath. Marcus sat behind his desk, a monolith of polished obsidian that reflected the flickering lights of the skyline behind him. He was barely 32, yet he possessed the weary, sharp eyes of a man who had seen too many lifetimes. His black suit was tailored with a lethal precision, but tonight the top buttons of his white shirt were undone, a rare lapse in his armor. The movement revealed the dark ink that climbed his throat and chest, vivid, jagged tattoos of thorns and ravens that served as a visual history of every war he had survived to get here. These weren't mere decorations, they were the scars of a man who had climbed out of the gutter by being more calculated than his enemies and more ruthless than his friends. The men standing across from him, hardened veterans of the underworld, barely dared to breathe. They watched the way his large, scarred hand hovered over a glass of vintage scotch, never shaking, never hesitating. In the world of the Manhattan Mafia, Marcus was the final word. He didn't shout to get his way. He simply looked at a man until the person's own guilt or fear did the talking for him. He was a master of the long game, a strategist who saw the city as a complex grid of debts and favors. To Marcus, emotion was a biological glitch, a weakness that led to mistakes. He had built his empire on the belief that a heart was just a muscle that pumped blood, not a compass for making decisions. Tonight was supposed to be like any other. The ledgers were open, the territories were stable, and the protection taxes from the docks were ahead of schedule. The city was quiet under his thumb. He lived in a world where the only sounds were the scratching of expensive pens and the low murmur of men discussing power. He believed he was untouchable, insulated by his wealth and his cruelty. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, that rule was about to be shattered by a 7-year-old girl in a pink floral dress. The blue light of the smartphone screen cut through the dimness of the penthouse, casting a ghostly glow over Marcus's sharp features. He didn't recognize the number, and he never answered unknown calls, but a strange, icy intuition gripped his chest. With a flick of his thumb, the connection opened. He expected a rival's threat or a federal warning. Instead, he was met with the sight of a small, blonde girl in a pink floral dress, her face a canvas of raw, unchecked terror. She was huddled under a desk, the phone shaking so violently in her grip that the image blurred. "Help, please," she breathed, her voice a mere thread of sound that barely registered over the rain. The lieutenants in the room froze. They had seen Marcus handle hits, betrayals, and multi-million-dollar heists without blinking, but they had never seen the expression that now crossed his face, a flicker of something ancient and long buried. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the soul of the child on the screen. He didn't ask who she was or how she got his number. His voice, usually a cold rasp of authority, dropped into a low, steady calm. "Slow down," he commanded, though the command was wrapped in an uncharacteristic softness. "Who are you talking to? Where are you?" "My name is Lucy," she whispered, a fresh sob breaking through the call. "A man, he followed us from the park. Mama told me to hide in the bedroom. She's shouting at him downstairs." As if on cue, a sharp, violent crash echoed through the phone, the unmistakable sound of a heavy front door being kicked in, followed by the crystalline shatter of a window. Marcus's knuckles turned white around his phone. He could hear a man's muffled, aggressive voice rising from the background of the call, muffled only by the thin walls of a suburban home. "I'm in the house at the end of Willow Lane," Lucy whimpered, her eyes darting toward her bedroom door. "The one with the blue shutters. Please, he's coming up the stairs. I can hear his boots." The terror in her voice was a physical weight in the room. Marcus stood up, the heavy obsidian chair scraping against the marble floor like a roar. He didn't look at his men, yet they were already reaching for their jackets, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The king of the penthouse was gone. In his place was a hunter who had just found a target. "Stay on the line, Lucy," Marcus said, his voice now vibrating with a lethal promise as he strode toward the elevator. "Don't move, don't make a sound. I'm coming, and I'm bringing the dark with me." As the elevator plummeted toward the garage, the polished chrome walls reflected a version of Marcus that he had spent 15 years trying to bury. The panicked cadence of Lucy's breathing through the phone speaker was a hauntingly familiar rhythm, a metronome that dragged his consciousness back to a rain-slicked alley in Queens, long before he had a throne or a title. Before he was the king of the penthouse, he was just Marcus, a boy with nothing but a thin jacket and a younger sister named Sarah who looked exactly like the girl on the screen. He could still smell the wet asphalt of that night, still feel the desperate weight of Sarah's small hand in his as they tried to outrun the shadows of their father's deaths. He had told her to hide behind the rusted dumpsters, promised her that he would lead the men away and come back for her. He had been fast, but the shadows had been faster. By the time he had fought his way back, the alley was empty. Sarah was gone, consumed by a world that didn't care about the cries of children, leaving Marcus with a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of power could ever fill. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a surge of adrenaline and old unhealed grief that turned the fire in his eyes into something volcanic. The thorns tattooed on his neck seemed to tighten as his jaw set in a line of lethal intent. He wasn't just going to Willow Lane to stop a break-in. He was going there to wage war against the ghost of his own failure. Every step he took toward his armored SUV was a step for Sarah, a chance to rewrite a tragedy that had defined his life. He gripped the leather of his jacket, pulling it on over his ink-stained sleeves with a violent snap. He didn't care about the territories, the protection taxes, or the delicate balance of the 5 boroughs tonight. In his mind, the map of New York had shrunk down to a single point, a house with blue shutters where a girl in a pink dress was waiting for a savior. "I'm still here, Lucy," Marcus said, his voice now vibrating with a lethal promise as he strode toward the elevator. "Don't move, don't make a sound. I'm coming, and I'm bringing the dark with me." His lieutenants climbed into the following vehicles, their faces grim. They knew that look. It was the look of a man who was no longer calculating the cost of his actions. As the garage doors hissed open and the black tires bit into the wet pavement, Marcus Blackwood didn't see the city lights. He only saw the face of the sister he had lost, and he swore to the God he had long ago stopped believing in that tonight the shadow would not win. The heavy garage doors of the Blackwood Tower hissed open like the jaws of a predator, and 3 black SUVs tore out into Manhattan rain with a ferocity that stopped traffic dead. At the lead was Marcus's custom-armored beast, its engine a low, guttural roar that echoed off the skyscraper walls. Inside, the cabin was a cocoon of lethal intent. Marcus sat in the back, his phone still gripped in one hand, his other hand clenched so tightly the leather of the seat groaned. "Faster," Marcus said, his voice a cold blade of iron. The driver didn't hesitate. He swung the massive vehicle into the oncoming lane, sirens hidden behind the grille wailing as they blurred past yellow taxis and panicked pedestrians. They weren't just driving, they were cutting through the city like a scalpel. Marcus watched the GPS on his dashboard, a pulsing red dot on Willow Lane that seemed 1,000 miles away. Every red light they blew through was a law they had already broken 1,000 times over, but tonight the defiance felt different. He wasn't running from the police, he was racing toward a soul. On the screen, Lucy's breathing had become shallow, terrified hitches. Marcus could hear the heavy thud of boots on wood, the sound of a man who thought he was the most dangerous thing in the house. The distance between the penthouse and the suburbs was shrinking with every screech of the tires. The motorcade banked onto the FDR Drive, the black SUVs weaving through the Friday night rush with a synchronized, terrifying precision. They were a shadow moving through the light, a king's wrath mobilized at 80 miles per hour. Marcus stared out at the blurred city lights, his reflection in the glass overlaying the memory of Sarah's lost face. His men in the vehicles behind him were silent over the comms. They knew this wasn't a tactical maneuver or a territorial dispute. It was a man trying to outrun his own shadow. As they crossed the bridge, the city skyline began to fade into the flatter, darker stretches of the suburbs. The urban roar gave way to the rhythmic slap of windshield wipers and the high-pitched hum of the engine. 3 minutes out, boss, the driver muttered, his eyes fixed on the road. Marcus checked the slide of his weapon, the metallic click punctuating the silence of the car. He looked back at the phone. "Lucy, I'm turning onto your street. I see the blue shutters. Stay exactly where you are. The king is here." The SUVs didn't slow down as they entered the quiet neighborhood. They accelerated, the headlights cutting through the suburban dark like searchlights, signaling the end of the intruder's reign. The screech of tires on wet asphalt was the only warning the quiet suburban street received before Marcus's SUV jumped the curb, coming to a violent halt on the front lawn of the house with the blue shutters. Before the engine had even stopped turning, he was out the door, a dark blur of motion in the rain. He didn't wait for his men. He didn't wait for a plan. The sound of Lucy's whimpering over the still active line was the only compass he needed. He reached the front porch in 3 strides. The door hung off its hinges, the wood splintered where a heavy boot had forced its way in. Inside, the house smelt of lavender and vanilla, not gunpowder and expensive scotch. He stepped over a shattered ceramic vase, his boots crunching on the remnants of a life he had never been allowed to have. His eyes cold and sharp as obsidian, locked on the staircase. From the floor above he heard it, a slow rhythmic creak of floorboards. It was the sound of a predator who thought he was alone with his prey. Marcus moved up the stairs with a predatory silence that defied his size, his shadow stretching long and ominous against the floral wallpaper of the hallway. As he reached the landing, he saw him. A man in a heavy, grease-stained jacket stood at the end of the hall, his hand already reaching for the brass knob of the bedroom door, the door where a little girl in a pink dress was holding her breath, praying for a miracle. The intruder was muttering to himself, a low, guttural sound that made the ink on Marcus's neck itch with a primal fury. In that moment, Marcus wasn't thinking about the law or the delicate politics of his empire. He was back in that alley in Queens, watching the shadows close in on his sister. But this time, he was the shadow. This time, the monster wasn't going to win. The intruder never heard him coming. Marcus didn't call out a warning. He didn't give the man a chance to turn around. He closed the distance in a heartbeat. His large, scarred hand shot out, gripping the man's shoulder like a vice and spinning him away from the door with a force that sent him crashing into the opposite wall. The man gasped, his eyes widening as he looked up into the face of a man who looked like he had been forged in the deepest pits of hell. "You're in the wrong house," Marcus whispered, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the home. He stood between the predator and the bedroom door, a mountain of black ink and righteous rage, finally standing in the gap he had failed to fill 15 years ago. The intruder scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a mask of panicked aggression. He was a thick-set man, smelling of stale sweat and cheap beer, the kind of predator who only felt brave when his victims were smaller than him. He reached into his waistband, his fingers closing around the handle of a serrated knife, but he was moving through water compared to the lightning in Marcus's veins. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stepped into the man's space, a mountain of black silk and jagged ink that seemed to swallow the light in the hallway. When the intruder lunged, he caught his wrist with a sickening crack, the sound of bone meeting absolute authority. The knife clattered to the floor, forgotten, as Marcus drove a heavy knee into the man's midsection, folding him like a piece of scrap paper. With a handful of the man's greasy hair, he slammed him against the wall again, his other hand tightening around the intruder's throat. The intruder's feet dangled inches off the carpet, his face turning a dark, bruised purple as he clawed fruitlessly at Marcus's tattooed arms. "You thought this was an easy mark," Marcus hissed, his voice a low, lethal vibration that bypassed the ears and went straight to the bone. "You thought you could walk into a home and hunt a child." He leaned in closer, his obsidian eyes reflecting the man's frantic, bulging gaze. "In this city, I am the one who decides who lives and who fades away. And tonight, you made the last mistake of your miserable life." The intruder tried to wheeze out a plea, but Marcus's grip was a closed door. This wasn't a fight, it was a reckoning. It was the physical manifestation of 15 years of bottled rage and the silent promise Marcus had made to a sister who never came home. He saw the man's spirit break before his body did, the moment the predator realized he wasn't facing a hero, but something much more terrifying, a king who had left his throne to personally handle the trash. With a final brutal shove, Marcus threw the man down the stairs. The intruder tumbled in a chaotic heap of limbs, landing unconscious on the hardwood of the foyer. Marcus didn't spare him a second glance. He wiped a drop of the man's blood from his cuff with a chillingly calm precision, his breathing barely elevated. The monster was dealt with, but the king's work wasn't finished. He turned back toward the bedroom door, his expression softening as he prepared to face the only person in the world who could make Marcus Blackwood's heart beat for something other than power. Marcus stood before the bedroom door, the silence of the hallway now heavy and thick. He took a single, steadying breath, consciously smoothing the jagged edge of his features. With a touch as light as a whisper, he turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the soft, pale glow of a nightlight, casting long shadows across the walls. Lucy was still huddled under the desk, a tiny island of pink floral fabric in the darkness. Her eyes were wide, luminous with tears, and her knuckles were white around the smartphone. When she saw the silhouette in the doorway, the man from the screen, she didn't scream. She simply exhaled, a ragged, broken sound that seemed to drain the last of her strength. Marcus didn't loom over her. He didn't stay standing as the king of a violent empire. Instead, he sank to one knee on the plush carpet, his expensive black trousers creasing as he made himself small. He looked at her, his obsidian eyes softening into something that hadn't been seen in over a decade. He slowly reached out, keeping his palm open and visible, revealing the thorns of his tattoos not as a threat, but as a shield. "It's over, Lucy," he said, his voice a low, melodic hum of safety. "He can't hurt you. No one is ever going to hurt you again." The little girl crawled out from under the desk, her tiny movements hesitant and fragile. She looked at the sharp lines of his suit and then up at his face, searching for the monster the world feared. Finding none, she collapsed into him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Marcus froze for a fraction of a second. The physical contact was a foreign language to his skin, before his large hand came up to rest gently on her back, anchoring her to the world. His lieutenants reached the top of the stairs, weapons drawn and eyes scanning for threats. They stopped dead at the threshold, their expressions shifting from combat-ready to utter disbelief. They watched as the man who had ordered the dismantling of entire syndicates without a second thought now sat on a child's bedroom floor, murmuring quiet reassurances and smoothing back stray blonde hairs with a chillingly calm precision, his breathing barely elevated. The monster was dealt with, but the king's work wasn't finished. He turned back toward the bedroom door, his expression softening as he prepared to face the only person in the world who could make Marcus Blackwood's heart beat for something other than power. The heavy silence that followed Sarah and Lucy's reunion was broken only by the clinical, efficient arrival of Marcus's cleanup crew. They moved through the suburban home like ghosts, their faces impassive as they gathered the shattered remains of the vase and wiped away the traces of the intruder's violence. Downstairs, the predator had already been removed. He hadn't been taken to a hospital or a police station, but to a place where men like him simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. Marcus stood on the front porch, the rain now a soft mist that clung to his black wool coat. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. Across the street, the black SUVs sat with their engines idling, a line of dark sentinels guarding the street. He didn't look back into the house, but his ears were tuned to the sound of Sarah's soft, relieved weeping inside. He gestured to his lead lieutenant, a man named Elias who had served the Blackwood family for 20 years. "The debt," Marcus said, the word barely more than a whisper against the wind. "The one that brought that trash here. Find out who held it." "It was a low-level firm out of Jersey, boss," Elias replied, checking a tablet. "Predatory stuff. They sold the paper to a collection crew when she fell behind on the medical bills." "Buy it," Marcus commanded, his eyes tracking a single drop of rain as it slid down the obsidian glass of his SUV. "Buy the debt, the interest, and the contract, then burn it. I want a deed sent to this house by morning, fully paid, clear title. If any collector so much as drive down this block again, I want their hands brought to me." Elias nodded, already tapping out the orders that would redistribute thousands of dollars with a single keystroke. In Marcus's world, money was the ultimate eraser. It could delete a person's past and secure their future, provided the right man was wielding the pen. By the time Marcus stepped into his car, the Bennett family was no longer a target. They were a protected asset, shielded by the most formidable financial and physical wall in the city. As the motorcade began to pull away, Marcus looked at the small, glowing window of Lucy's bedroom. He didn't feel like a hero. He was a man who lived in the dark, and he knew his hands would never truly be clean. But as he watched the blue shutters fade into the night, he felt a strange, quiet stillness in his chest. For the first time since Sarah disappeared into that alleyway in Queens, the balance had shifted. The debt he owed to his own past hadn't been paid in full, but tonight he had finally made a down payment. 6 months had passed since the rain-slicked night that changed everything on Willow Lane. The suburban street was now bathed in the golden, honeyed light of a late summer afternoon. The house with the blue shutters stood peaceful and silent, its garden blooming with fresh hydrangeas and the front door reinforced with a subtle, high-grade security system that looked like a simple piece of modern hardware. Inside, the air no longer carried the scent of fear. It was filled with the sound of a humming kitchen and the distant, playful melody of a child's cartoons. Lucy Bennett stood by the upstairs window, her tiny blonde hair catching the sunlight as she pulled back the curtain. She wasn't looking for intruders anymore. She wasn't scanning the shadows for a man who followed her home. Instead, her eyes traveled to the corner of the block, where a familiar black SUV sat idling under the shade of an old oak tree. The windows were tinted a deep, impenetrable obsidian, reflecting the quiet neighborhood like a dark mirror. She knew who was behind that glass. She knew that inside that vehicle sat a man with thorns and ravens tattooed across his skin, a man that the rest of the world whispered about in terrifying tones. To the city, Marcus Blackwood was a sovereign of shadows, a cold-blooded king who ruled an empire of secrets. But to Lucy, he was simply the man who had answered the phone when the world went dark. Every Tuesday and Friday, the car would appear. It never moved, and no one ever stepped out to knock on the door. It was a silent vigil, a promise kept in the form of idling steel and watchful eyes. Marcus no longer lived only for the calculation of power. He lived for the quiet moments when he could see through a long-range lens that Lucy was safe, that her mother was smiling, and that the shadows he controlled were keeping the lesser monsters at bay. The king of the penthouse still wore his black suits and conducted his meetings in glass cathedrals, but his soul was no longer a hollow vault. He had found a way to bridge the gap between his violent world and the innocence he had once lost. Lucy waved a small, shy hand toward the SUV, a tiny gesture of recognition. From behind the tinted window, Marcus watched the girl in the pink dress, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had become a guardian angel who wore the devil's colors. As the SUV finally began to pull away, leaving the quiet street behind, Lucy let the curtain fall. She went back to her toys, unafraid and at peace, knowing that she was the only girl in the city who had the most dangerous man in New York watching over her sleep. The ghost of Sarah was finally still, and for Marcus Blackwood, the darkness was no longer a prison, it was a shield.